Okay, so there are two ways of looking at not only the history, but pretty much any science, according to Ilyenkov. And one is historical, but another one is logical. And he argues that Marx choosing the logical method rather than the historical method, and only using the historical method as a supplementary, is not only justified, but is actually correct. And especially in the case of looking at political economy, we actually greatly benefited from Marx looking into the logical sequencing, so to speak, the logical order of the conceptualization and the concretization of the substance of capital. But this can be applied to, just as I mentioned before, to any sciences, and this I repeat after Ilyenkov. And he actually insists that a lot of the critics of Marx and the critics of Marxist political economy, they actually think that not using the historical method is lacking, it's going to be lacking, and you have to look at the whole body of history and all of the historical figures who looked at the economy from various viewpoints, which Marx actually did to an extent, but that was not his major way of looking at the way that capital formed. Because the most simple form of commodity production was a very, very long time ago. It happened a very, very long time ago. And there is no use for us to try and find the actual empirical data about every single instance of all the different little subtypes, all the different special or particular types of trade and commodity production in order for us to understand the principle of commodity production. But what I actually wanted to talk about is a little bit unrelated to an extent to what I just talked about before. It is about the induction versus deduction, because Marx has also been accused of using deduction too much, relying on deductive conclusions, meaning that he had, according to those critics, too much of a bias. He came into looking at political economy and the history of humankind with a certain specific agenda. Therefore, he's not objective. Look at him. He's not looking at history. He's not using an inductive method or the method of induction, which was seen as superior at one point, and therefore he must be wrong. But Ilyenkov actually proves in his work, The Dialectics of the Abstract and the Concrete in Karl Marx's Capital, the book that I continuously recommend. By the way, there is a newer version of it that was published in the 90s. Of course, Ilyenkov at that point was already dead, but somebody compiled some of his later writing into that work. So maybe I'll be able to find it and share it with you as well. But nonetheless, the Dialectics of the Abstract and the Concrete, in the third or the fourth chapter, Ilyenkov discusses how all of the previous researchers, scientists, political economists, and historians and philosophers before Marx were actually not using the inductive method. They were not using the method of induction. They thought they did. They thought they had this whole tabula rasa thing going on, or however it is pronounced. They thought that they did not have those preconceived notions, and they were not seeking out any kind of an agenda. They were the honest seekers of the truth. But when we look at their conclusions, when we see how they did not take into account how the cause and effect dialectically become interchanged in their positions, when they only look at commodity as a cell of capitalism, they do not look at it as a prerequisite for capitalism, and how capitalism later on starts needing commodity production in order to continue to exist. This is where they don't see this mutual exchange of places between the two. They don't see how the commodity production was a prerequisite for capitalism to appear. However, it wasn't linear, right? It wasn't like, as soon as commodity production started to exist, then inevitably capitalism was going to become the dominating form of production. Because again, it is not the case historically. If we look at all kinds of different trades the people had during feudal times, during slave ownership times, people did not form their life around commodity production. People's lives and lifestyles were not bound to commodity production as it is now. And that, of course, is not the only reason why we know that commodity production is only one of the prerequisites to capitalism. Of course, the resources, the materials are also necessary. They're all prerequisites. However, they do not constitute the essence of capitalism. The essence of the movement of capital is in the fact that surplus value is created by labor, but then it is distributed not according to the needs or necessity, it is distributed according to individual will. So collective production, individual distribution, or individual consumption. And thus we see that it doesn't really matter when historically commodity production appeared. It was only a prerequisite. It didn't even have to lead to capitalism, and it didn't. For centuries, trade did not lead to capitalism. But again, I digress. Even scientists or philosophers like Adam Smith, who thought that they were very much unbiased and very much using the inductive method, was actually using a deductive method too, because he took for granted the production that he already was living in, the conditions of production he was already living in. So he became an apologist of the status quo. And so were all the rest of the researchers and philosophers and the scientists of the late 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, all of those who created those philosophies and those myths that we still heavily rely on in our public discourse. So a lot of the people, laymen, so to speak, still view the world through that lens. They think that hard work is going to get you the best results. You're going to become rich one day if you work hard, if you persevere. Capitalists deserve whatever it is they have because they must have been the best workers in the world, etc., etc. So all of this mythos was beginning to form itself into a concrete ideology around Adam Smith's time, because Adam Smith, as a British philosopher and political economist, I believe he was one of those as well, he took it for granted that whatever was around him was the nature of things. This was the final result of everything, of the accumulation of history, and everything must have led to this result. So it's not only highly determinist, it is also very idealist, because he took it for granted that his notions, his views and reflections on the world corresponded with reality, and therefore he believed he had a conceptualization, but he only mirrored back what was on the surface. He only saw the trees and he took the trees for the forest. He did not see the rest of it. So he saw the features of capitalism, the prerequisites of capitalism, as a justification, ultimate justification for capitalism to exist and to be the most perfect mode of production, etc., etc. So this type of apologia still continues to this day, and Ilyenkov debunks it in the work that I mentioned before, much more eloquently than I am able to recreate here. So go ahead and read this work. But to finish off, conclude this all, kind of try and wrap up all of the loose threads that I started in this video. Not only was Marx's analysis logical and historical only in supplementation, it was also deductive for a reason, because none of us are able to perceive reality just the way it is. We have to look at all the layers, and not only of propaganda and whatnot, not only of ideology. It is because things do appear a certain way because they are a result of the resolution of various contradictions. And we have to look into the genesis, the becoming of those objects in the form they're in. And then we will be able to see the essence of the object only when we've seen not only historically, but logically how they came to be. And this is when we will find the contradiction. We will see how the inevitability of a certain solution in nature, it always requires a process of cause and effect. And then the cause and effect are going to switch places. So these are the methods that Ilyenkov thoroughly describes. So please read more of him. But otherwise, I hope you have a great day today. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your community first. Subscribe to me on all the other social media accounts, even though I don't do much there. And I'll talk to you sometime later.